It's certainly a bit of a sense of repetition. I feel like we've been here before. So if there's new people joining, we're just asking how time feels today. Yeah, I feel that too. Where has the morning gone? Maybe a lot of it on Twitter. Willing time forward as we find out the results of what's going on in America. Oh, not your own. No, that's tough. Yeah, distracted. Yeah, it's amazingly malleable time, isn't it? And incredibly relative and specific to individual situations. Should we give it one more minute, Noel, or see if anyone's grabbing a bit of lunch?
That sounds good.
Oh, that's interesting, Michaela, isn't it? Yeah, days feel the same. The kind of distinction between weekends and weekdays and birthdays and normal days certainly feel quite similar to me at the moment. Stretched and squeezed, yeah. Yeah, Groundhog Day. Oh, that's interesting. Difference between the time at work and time at home. I find I get to the end of the day at the moment and I sort of feel a little panicked about what I'm going to do. I'm sort of relieved to be in my own time, and then I'm thinking, how do I make this time my own? It's really hard with those days that you spend sitting on Zoom or on Teams, isn't it? And you don't. I think I'd forgotten how much just moving around an office sort of punctuated my day. Oh, a little mood to think about the future. Well, we'll be doing a bit of that for the next hour, so hopefully I can edge it along. I think we're ready to go now. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, let's start. So thanks everyone for joining, whether you're having lunch or just come out of a meeting or in between meetings, or even if this is your kind of day off and you're choosing this as an interval to kind of to think about kind of the long time. I went to kind of a long time session that we'll talk about what the long time is, but a kind of a few weeks ago to help co-produce with some tools that Bee's going to talk about, and it kind of like it felt so urgent, ironically, to think about kind of the long time, particularly now as so much is changing, so much is disrupting, so much is affecting people in kind of in different ways. So I'm really pleased to be here at kind of our session, and really excited to have a variety of different people here today, from councils, from the charity sector, from universities, and other organisations as well. So thanks for joining. Or this is being recorded, so if you don't want to show your faces, turn off your kind of video, and there will be an opportunity to kind of discuss in smaller groups towards the end. But without further ado, I'd like to hand back to you, Bea.
Thanks, Noel, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm going to start just by quickly acknowledging the future and say that, as we start this session today, we acknowledge the world that will exist beyond our lifetimes and the people, animals and nature that will thrive in it. And I'm going to go straight into an exercise. So I think everyone's got their sort of screens turned off, but if you please do that. It's great if you're in a space where you can take a couple of steps backwards or forwards, and somewhere where you feel comfortable closing your eyes so that you can do some imagining into the past and future. If you can't stand up, don't worry. And I'll invite you now just to step out of your seats. I assume a lot of you are sitting, and to join me on an exercise, the human layers exercise. So I just want to take a minute for everyone to come into the present moment, take a breath, arrive, feel the ground beneath your feet, and be present today at 12 on Thursday, the 5th of November 2020. Just for a moment, be really present in the moment now. And I'm going to invite you to bring to mind somebody who you feel close to, who you feel warmly towards, of your grandparents' age. They may or may not be still with us. You might be related to them. They might be somebody who you just knew and were close to. Think of them and think of one of the qualities that they have that evokes warmth in you. It could be their smile, it could be something about the way they laughed or they said to you, it could be their hand. And I'd like you, if you can, to carefully take one step backwards. Step back in time and imagine that older person or person who's not with us now at age 40. What were they like then? How is that quality that you really value in them, that quality that evokes warmth, how in them then when they were 40? So just take a moment to connect with them at that age in the past. And now I'm going to invite you to take another small step backwards and imagine that you're at that person's 9th birthday. They're having a birthday party. How is that quality that evokes warmth in you present in them then? Could you see it in them when they were 9 years old? What do they look like? What's their favourite foods? Imagine who else is there at the party. When is it? It could be the 1920s or 30s. It could be earlier or later. Think about when it is and think about where they are. Think about the house or the field or playground that they're in. Imagine for a moment that you walk over to a window and just for a moment you turn your back on the party. What can you see outside the window? What's the world like? How are people moving around? How are they communicating with each other? Just imagine that world for a moment. And now turn away from the window, turn back to the room. Take a moment to drink in this birthday party of the person that you've cared about. Savor it for a moment. And then I'm going to invite you to take your leave. So take a small step forward, stepping forward through the generations. And again, step forward another step. You're briefly back in the present on the 5th of November 2020. Take a moment to be here. Breathe deeply and let go of that older person. Feel the ground beneath your feet in the present day. Take a big breath in. And as you release that breath, I want you to think about a small person who you feel warmly towards. It might be a child, it might be a grandchild or a niece or godchild or the offspring of friends. Just think about that child and hold them in your mind for a moment. And think about one of their qualities that evokes warmth in you. Is it their smile? Is it their laugh? Is it their little feet? And I'm going to invite you to step forwards one step. Take a step forward in time and imagine that little person aged 40. What are they like? And how is that quality that evokes warmth in you present in them? Just take a moment to connect with them in the future. And I'm going to invite you to take another step forward. It's now this person's 90th birthday. We've stepped far into the future. They're sitting around a table and they are being celebrated by their friends and family. They're laughing. It's a happy place. How is that quality that you value so much present in them at 90? Is it the same thing that's making them laugh? What do they look like? What food do they love? Just enjoy the warmth of the party for a moment. Think about when this is. I think it's probably around the end of the century, so it could be 2090, 2095. We're far in the future now. And imagine that again, you walk over to the window and for a moment you turn your back on the party. What's happening outside that window? What is the world like in 2090? How are people getting around? How are they communicating with each other? What does that world look like? Now turn your attention back to the room. because in the room there's a framed picture of you on the table. And that person who you care about, that person who's celebrating their 90th birthday, taps their glass and asks for everyone's attention. And they raise their glass and they toast you. They are saying thank you for something that you did that helped shape their world for the better. What are they toasting you for? Stay in that moment for a moment. How does that feel? Take a few deep breaths and connect to your legacy. And now I'm going to invite you to take your leave. So take one small step backwards through the generations, and take another step backwards to the present. Keep your eyes shut for a moment and just land back here in the present moment, 20 minutes past 12 on Thursday, the 5th of November, 2020. Take a deep breath, and when you're ready, slowly open your eyes. So you've just time traveled about 200 years and crossed 7 generations. And so just take a minute to think about how that feels. And hopefully that's everyone back in the room. Like Noel said, I wanted to share with you this afternoon a bit about the Long Time Project, about where it's come from, why we need it now, and some of the work that we've done over the summer, where we have been working with people in local government in the UK, but also across the world, with people working in national government and some international bodies as well, to explore some of this mental time travel and start to think about how we can support different organisations and individuals and communities to establish a sense of care for the world beyond our lifetimes. So I'm going to screen share briefly, if you bear with me. I'm sorry that I haven't managed to get this to work as full screen, so you will see some of the stuff that's around it, but should be able to get most of it. So my colleagues Ella Saltmarsh and Bea Pembroke set up the Long Time Project a couple of years ago with the idea that in order to preserve the future and to look after the world and the earth as we enjoy it at the moment, we need to be able to care for it, and we need to be able to feel an emotional connection to future generations and to the human and non-human things that will exist in the future if we care about them. And the second big idea that the Long Time Project is based on is that by developing this deep connection to the long-term future, we will be able to better, more easily, more effectively change the way that we behave in the short term. So I don't probably need to go on too much about why thinking about long-termism or long-timism matters. I think, you know, you might have seen people responding to the election saying that actually the current US election is not about the next 4 years, it's about the next millennia. And I think that's a really important point to think about when we think about the role that we have right now at this critical point in the history of the Earth as a pivotal generation that can make a decision to change the path that we're on or completely fail to do so. We face an existential threat on a level that's unprecedented. It's a threat to human life, but it's also a threat to non-human life. And through climate change, we are looking at biodiversity loss and the destruction of entire ecosystems in a completely irreversible way. So that's the bad stuff, which, you know, I'm sure you're all really conscious of and not too far away from, even on a daily basis. But there are also some really positive signs to look at. There is strong momentum behind the idea of a long time moment or the growing movement behind long-termism. We could look at the Future Generations Act in Wales, which is worth looking at. And while there have been different attempts to kind of establish commissioners or ministers for the future, ministers for future generations, Wales is really interesting because it's enshrined in law, and all public bodies have to report on the impact that they will have on the well-being of future generations. So, you know, it's things like that that are making a difference. And at the same time, we're seeing a kind of growth in legal rights for the environment, for non-human beings, a return to respecting and listening to and learning from Indigenous wisdom, which has a much more, in many cases, and you know, it's different across the world, but has a much more sophisticated way of engaging with time. And we could look at stuff like Bolivia's Rights of Mother Earth, where they are trying to enshrine the rights of nature within the constitution. You might have seen or heard from an academic and thinker called Roman Snarich, whose book came out at the beginning of the summer, How to Be a Good Ancestor, which is really helpful. I'm just seeing people popping up in the in the slide deck. Hopefully you can all see it. Do give me a shout if you can't. Oh, I see. Can everyone see it from my screen presenting? Yeah, cool. Thanks. In order to kind of embrace this stewardship of the future, we need to be able to have that emotional connection to the world beyond our lifetimes. And we need to be able to cultivate a sense of care. Now, one of the things that is a real problem, and one of the stories that we sort of tell ourselves about the relationship that we have with time, is that human beings are not very good at thinking about the future. And that manifests itself in ways like when scientists have been doing MRI scans of the brain, the way that we relate to our future self is as a stranger. So, you know, the different parts of our brain fire up when we're thinking about ourselves in the future to when we're thinking about ourselves in the present. There is a bit of distance there. There is a phenomenon called hyperbolic discounting, where we devalue things the further into the future they are. So on a very simple level, I would rather take £5 from you today than I would £10 in 2 weeks' time. But also this has really important implications in government because of something called the discounting rate, where when policies are evaluated, the future benefits, the longer term benefits of those policies are discounted and devalued against things that have a very short-term impact and benefit. And of course, I hope this probably goes without saying, but but in many cases, being able to think about the future, being able to plan for the future, being able to think beyond the next paycheck or the next meal or the next bed that you're going to sleep in, is a real privilege, and that financial precarity and instability shortens your time horizons. But there are ways to start to think about the future, and one of the things that Roman draws attention to in his book is this idea of not just the marshmallow brain, where we want things now and we want them in the present, but the idea of the acorn brain, where our ancestors were much better than we are now at planting that acorn to grow the tree that would bear fruit for future generations. Because one of the things that makes us unique as human beings to other species is the very special ability that we have to be able to think about the future and dream about the future and imagine what might be coming next. One of the distinctions that we make within the Long Time Project is a slight distinction between long-termism and long-timism. So long-termism often is about planning and forecasting and being ready for the future and sort of trying to lock that future down. Long-timism is very simply about cultivating care for the world beyond our lifetimes. And I think it's important to make that distinction, because there are different ways that we can engage with the future, and sometimes kind of the planning and forecasting way is really difficult and not appropriate for all cases. So being able to also build a kind of culture of care and engagement and connection to things that are not going to affect us as individuals is really critical to sort of moving this thinking forward. And it also means that we can be very relaxed about the different time horizons that we have. The sort of question that I started out with about how time feels to you today. You know, if you are somebody who's looking after a new baby, you might just be thinking about the next sleep, yours or theirs, or next feed or nappy change. If you are working on a really big long-term project, your time horizons might feel longer and they might feel different at different times. But for the purpose of the Long Time Project, it actually sort of doesn't matter how long term is, or whether we're talking about 5 or 25 or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 years into the future. What matters is that we've got that emotional connection to a future where we're not going to be there in body. And as part of the work, when we kicked this off, we started looking for examples of where different countries, different communities, different thinkers were using tools to help to provoke that kind of long-term thinking. We've got a huge list of over 40, which I hope we will publish quite soon, which takes a kind of really wide range of examples, from very technical evaluations of policies or kind of business planning, right through to much more symbolic tools, or the kind of wealth of art and culture, music, that engages with this question of the long-term future. And what we're intending to do is publish it and encourage people to add to it as they come across things that might be relevant to kind of help show the growing body of tools and work in this area. But for now, I'm going to give you 3 examples. So one is the Children's Fire, which is present in quite a range of a few different ancient and indigenous cultures, where the idea is that when community leaders or community elders were coming together to make big decisions on behalf of the group, a fire would be lit at the centre of the circle to represent the well-being and the needs of the children who were alive then and who were also yet to be born. And if an idea did not properly take into account the needs or well-being of those future generations, it could be thrown onto the fire. And you'll see when I talk about the toolkit that we developed over the summer, working with different policymakers, that we recognised that it might be difficult for those of you who work in institutions and organisations and, you know, just general standard homes and offices, that fire is probably not appropriate, but that the alternative that one of the groups came up with was to have an empty chair. So at meetings, you could have an empty chair for future generations as a kind of very physical reminder of the needs of those people who are yet to be born. Another example, which has a lot of really solid research and evaluation behind it, is that of future design in Japan, which was again influenced by indigenous practices and wisdom, and led by an economist. And the idea is that in community meetings, in kind of town hall meetings, where there are decisions being made and kind of deliberative events to work out the pros and cons, concerns, appetite for different policies, that some of the people in the room are given ceremonial robes. You can see the people in their green robes there, and they are there as advocates from the future. So they are arguing as somebody from future generations to give their point of view on the decision that's being made in the present. And one of the interesting things, if you ever want to sort of trawl through the papers that this kind of movement has produced, the evaluations, is that the people who were representing the future generations were much more likely to make decisions based on longer term thinking than those who weren't. So one of the really positive things to take away from that is that once you start thinking in this way, your brain can adapt to it quite quickly. And the third example that I want to share is one that comes from the Long Now Foundation that some of you may be aware of, which kind of started out as a data problem and with kind of roots in fears around the millennium bug and whether computers were going to break because of the numerical dating system. But is a really simple thing of adding an extra digit onto our year calendar so that we, in a kind of very regular everyday way, situate ourselves within a much deeper stretch of time than the 9,999 years that 4 digits would offer us. And I like it because it's like I say, like quite a neat example that just provokes that reminder of a much deeper time than we'd normally think about. So we took these ideas and we started to say, well, how do we make sense of this within organisations? What are the different routes into long-termism that we have within organisations? And we were really lucky to work with a really inventive, diverse range of people from different levels of government in different countries, and working alongside artists and creatives. So some of them were kind of visual artists, musicians, designers, to really start to bring together the rich kind of cultural examples of long-termism and that quite expansive thinking with the very practical policy needs of working in often quite short-term environments with very tight budgets and very real day-to-day demands. And through running these like really long, in-depth workshops where people had to get kind of quite honest with themselves and quite raw, we developed what we've called the long time levers model. Because we noticed, and you'll see on this slide, that we make the distinction between operational factors and cultural factors. Now, we didn't think about this. This comes from a thing called the cultural web, which is a kind of long-standing framework for looking at how to influence different aspects of organisation and what makes up organisational culture. And what we found when we were talking to a lot of the policymakers who we were working with was that the kind of the go-to places when thinking about long-termism were often operational factors. So people would think about 5-year plans, or they would think about the difficulty of annual budgets. And that trying to be long-term often meant trying to lock things down, which, again, a lot of the policymakers that we were working with said makes their jobs really hard and just isn't practical or realistic in a world where a pandemic can arrive and throw everything up in the air. And so one of the things that we started thinking about was, well, okay, so we need to think about things like the discounting rate. We need to decouple the idea of long-termism from this very rigid kind of Soviet style planning to what does agile long-term planning look like? What does flexible long-term planning look like? And how can we bring a long-term lens to budgeting cycles and kind of what are the very technical aspects of that. Now, figuring that out is obviously a really long and difficult process and not something that we were able to do in the summer. But luckily, we also wanted to look at what are the cultural aspects of long-termism that can start to build that sense of care, that can start to bring the far future much more closely into the present through things like the way that we behave at work, like the rituals and routines that we engage with when we're at work, like the symbols that we encounter every day in our organisations, and the stories that we tell ourselves about our work and our organisations. And from this, the policymakers that we worked with came up with 13 tools. One of those is the human layers exercise, which I took you through at the beginning of this session. Another one is the empty chair, which I've mentioned. There's one that I know that the team in Camden have been using, which was if your work is around service design, you're probably used to using personas. One group of policymakers came up with the idea of non-human personas. So, how do we just nudge people to think about the air quality or the needs of a particular area of woodland or something like that. So they are very light touch tools that just help to kind of stretch our thinking away from the immediacy that we encounter in our working lives and into a slightly longer term horizon. And I've been talking away for ages, so I will stop doing that for a moment, because I think, and I'm really sorry that I haven't been able to keep an eye on the chat, but that's really interesting. I think while everyone's in breakout groups, I'll take a look at that, and maybe we can discuss afterwards. But I think you should have some breakout groups available to you. Don't join them just yet, because what I will do first is put a link to the toolkit in the chat. And what I was going to invite you to do in the breakout groups is just to do a bit of reflection using the levers for long-termism, using that circular model, to think about where long-termism shows up in your organisation at the moment, because it might do already. You might have been sitting and thinking, we do some brilliant stuff, and actually this change has really helped us to think about long-termism. And the other thing that you might want to think about that was really helpful when we were sort of thinking about the different dynamics and influences on organisations is have a bit of a think about what are the drivers of short-termism, and they might be internal drivers of short-termism that come from your organisation, or they might be external drivers of short-termism that come from central government or pressure from the service users that you work with. I'll put those 2 questions in the chat so that you've got them at the top of your minds. And